You probably think you'd know evil if you saw it. A certain look, a twitch, that vibe. Hollywood's been training you for years. The serial killer with a dead stare, the villain with a chilling grin, the abuser hiding in shadows. We're taught to expect evil to look a certain way, grotesque, obvious, menacing. But in real life, evil rarely looks like a monster. More often, it looks completely ordinary. A neighbor mowing the lawn, a soft-spoken doctor, a charismatic co-worker. Sometimes, even someone you trust. That's the first dangerous myth we have to destroy. The belief that evil announces itself. It doesn't. In fact, the most disturbing truth is this. The worst acts in history have often been committed not by villains in masks, but by people who looked, sounded, and acted normal. Think about it. The man who organized the Nazi train schedules to Auschwitz, he was described as polite, punctual, though the guards in the Abu Ghraib torture photos, they took selfies smiling next to brutalized prisoners. Even serial killers like Ted Bundy were often described as charming, articulate, and intelligent. Some victims went willingly with him because they didn't feel like they were in danger. Why? Because we mistake appearance for morality. We believe good people look good, clean-cut, friendly, articulate. And we assume bad people look bad, creepy, weird, antisocial. But psychology tells a different story. In 1970, famed psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted his now infamous obedience experiment. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to another person, who was actually an actor. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer. Most people thought the majority would refuse to hurt someone. But Milgram found that over 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum voltage, even as the person screamed in pain. Why? Because they were told to. Because the authority figure said, "Please continue." Because they thought they were just doing their job. They didn't look evil. They weren't evil people. But their actions, that's what makes this so disturbing. Evil isn't always born from hatred. Sometimes it's born from compliance. You don't need fangs to harm someone. You just need to stop questioning. This is what psychologist Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The idea that horrific acts can be carried out by people who aren't sadistic monsters, but obedient workers just doing their job. Take Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. At his trial, people were shocked. He didn't seem deranged. He wasn't seething with rage. He was boring. He said things like, "I was just following orders." And that's the terrifying part. Sometimes evil isn't driven by darkness. It's driven by emptiness, a refusal to think, a lack of empathy, a person who stops seeing others as human. You might be wondering, could I be one of those people? Let's ask something uncomfortable. Have you ever gone along with something, even though it felt wrong, just to avoid conflict? Ever watched something unjust happen and said nothing? Most of us have. That doesn't make you evil, but it makes you human. And that's what makes evil so insidious. It hides in human psychology, in our desire to belong, in our instinct to obey, in our tendency to avoid discomfort. So here's the truth. The real monster isn't a lunatic in the shadows. It's the ordinary person who stops questioning, who numbs their conscience, who trades responsibility for routine. Evil wears a mask, and sometimes that mask looks just like your neighbor, or your boss, or yourself. And now that we've cracked the mask, it's time to go deeper. Because what if some people don't even feel that internal conflict? What if they harm others and feel nothing? You probably heard the word psychopath thrown around in movies, crime documentaries, maybe even casual insults. But what does it really mean? And more importantly, what does it feel like inside the mind of someone who has no empathy? Let's start with a chilling truth. Not all psychopaths are serial killers. In fact, many of them aren't violent at all. Some wear suits, run companies, charm audiences. They shake your hand and smile with their eyes, all while feeling absolutely nothing for you. That's because the core of psychopathy isn't murder. It's emotional disconnection. Research shows that people with high levels of psychopathy have a dramatically reduced capacity for empathy, not because they refuse to feel it, but because their brain literally doesn't light up in the same way yours does. In one study at the University of Wisconsin, researchers used functional MRI scans to observe the brains of diagnosed psychopaths while showing them images of people in pain. The average brain? Bursts of activity in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex, regions tied to empathy and emotional response. But in psychopathic brains? Silence. Those regions remain eerily quiet. Imagine seeing someone sob in front of you and feeling boredom or curiosity, but not concern. That's what this lack of emotional resonance looks like. But here's the twist. Many psychopaths learn to mimic emotion. They watch how others react. They study tone, timing, body language. They become emotional actors in a play they don't actually feel. And they're good at it. That's why so many psychopaths blend in. They're not foaming at the mouth or muttering to themselves. They're calculating, cool, persuasive. They mirror you to make you trust them, all while their internal world stays utterly still. Take Paul Bernardo, one half of the Canadian Ken and Barbie killers. During his interviews, he smiled, joked, even flirted. Investigators described his demeanor as chillingly polite. Meanwhile, his crimes were among the most sadistic in modern history. How can someone seem so normal and be so devoid of remorse? To answer that, we have to go deeper, into the structure of the psychopathic brain itself. When you look at the brain of a psychopath, one region keeps coming up, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. In a typical person, the amygdala lights up when you see a fearful face, sense danger, or even imagine hurting someone else. It kicks off that gut-clenching empathy response, that instinct to care, to hesitate, to protect. But in psychopaths, the amygdala is often underactive, or in some cases, structurally smaller. In plain terms, their emotional smoke detector barely goes off. Psychologist Dr. Ken Keel, one of the leading experts on psychopathy, spent years scanning the brains of inmates in high-security prisons. Over and over, he found the same anomaly, a kind of emotional blindness. The fear response that would normally scream, "Don't hurt them," was eerily silent. But here's what's more disturbing. That silence doesn't just apply to others' pain. It applies to their own consequences. You see, many psychopaths don't fear punishment the same way you do. The part of the brain responsible for anticipating negative consequences, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is also impaired in many psychopathic individuals. That's why so many seem reckless, impulsive, and remorseless. They're not immune to punishment. They just don't feel it coming. Their brains aren't wired for regret or guilt in the way most of us are. And yet, they can be remarkably intelligent. In fact, some psychopaths score high on IQ tests. They're articulate, persuasive, and charming. They know how to present the perfect version of themselves. And that's what makes them so dangerous. This duality, emotional coldness wrapped in social brilliance, is why psychopathy often hides in plain sight. Think about it. How many stories have you heard of the normal guy next door who turned out to be a monster? The friendly neighbor, the polished executive, the romantic partner who, behind closed doors, was capable of chilling cruelty? That's no coincidence. Psychopaths are often masters of masking. And if you're wondering how that mask forms, or whether someone could be born this way, we'll explore that in the next part. Here's the chilling question. Are psychopaths born or made? Science leans toward a complex mix of both. But let's start with the born side, the biological roots. There's growing evidence that certain genetic and neurodevelopmental factors set the stage for psychopathy early in life. For example, researchers have found that children who later develop high psychopathic traits often exhibit signs of callous and emotional (CU) behavior as early as age 4. Things like lack of guilt after hurting someone, indifference to others' distress, manipulating others without remorse. These aren't just bad behavior or a phase. These are early warning signs. One famous study conducted in the UK, the Murray Longitudinal Study, tracked thousands of children over decades. Kids showing CU traits often had reduced activity in the amygdala, even at a young age. It's like their empathy switch never got fully wired in. But genes aren't destiny. This is where nurture steps in, or fails to. A child predisposed to psychopathy may not become dangerous if they grow up in a warm, emotionally supportive environment. But throw that same child into a home filled with neglect, abuse, or chaos, and a mass begins to form, not for survival, but for advantage. One landmark study by Dr. S.E. Veeding at University College London showed that children with CU traits are less responsive to traditional parenting methods. You can't discipline out a lack of empathy. It requires specialized intervention, and most systems miss it. And here's where the myth becomes dangerous. When society sees psychopathy as a monster gene or pure evil, we tend to write people off, especially kids. But early intervention can change outcomes. If we spot the signs early enough, if we approach with understanding instead of fear, we might prevent some from turning into the predators we fear. The problem? Most people with these traits learn to blend in before anyone notices. They learn to mimic emotion, to smile, compliment, apologize. But there's no emotional weight behind the words. It's performance, strategic, and you'd never know unless you look closely. Here's a question that should stop you cold. What if the real danger isn't the monsters, but the mirror? We like to believe that evil is rare, something done by twisted minds, different from ours. It makes us feel safe, because if they are nothing like us, we don't have to look too closely at our own reflections. But psychology tells a more disturbing story, one where perfectly normal people, your neighbor, your co-worker, even you, are capable of cruelty under the right circumstances. It's unsettling, isn't it? But history backs it up. In 1961, Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, stood trial in Jerusalem. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't look like a villain. In fact, he looked ordinary, bureaucratic, even dull. Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher covering the trial, coined a phrase that still echoes: the banality of evil. Eichmann wasn't a monster. He was a clerk, a man who sent millions to their deaths with a stroke of a pen, not out of sadism, but out of obedience and indifference. And that's what haunts us. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a tie and shows up to work at 9 a.m. Chapter 3, The Banality of Harm, Why Ordinary People Do Terrible Things. Part 2. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram decided to test just how far ordinary people would go when told to follow orders, even if it meant hurting someone else. You may have heard of his infamous experiment. Volunteers thought they were helping with a study on memory. They were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner, an actor hidden behind a wall. Every time a learner got an answer wrong, with each mistake, the voltage increased. The learner screamed, then begged, then fell silent. And yet, 65% of participants continued to press the buttons all the way to the highest voltage, 450 volts, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. No threats, no weapons, just the presence of someone who looked like they knew better. And these weren't sadists. These were teachers, accountants, postal workers, normal people like you and me. What Milgram discovered was this chilling truth. People will commit acts they'd normally find unthinkable, not out of hatred, but out of obedience. Even more disturbing, many participants showed signs of stress, sweating, trembling, even laughing nervously, but continued anyway. Why? Because the real pressure wasn't physical. It was psychological. If I stop, I'm disobeying. If I continue, I'm just following orders. The mind desperately wants to believe it's still good, even when it's doing harm. Picture this. You're in a room with a stranger in a white lab coat. They're calm, collected. They tell you to press a button. Simple enough, right? But every time you do, someone behind a wall screams. You wince. You ask if it's safe. The person in the lab coat reassures you, firmly but politely. Please continue. You hesitate, heart pounding. But your hand moves anyway. This isn't fiction. This is history. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran one of the most disturbing experiments in modern psychology. The question he posed: could the average person be persuaded to inflict harm on another human being just because someone told them to? The answer, it turns out, was yes. Resoundingly yes. Milgram's study was born in the shadow of the Holocaust. After World War II, the world asked a chilling question: How could so many normal citizens, soldiers, clerks, guards, participate in such evil? Were they monsters? Or just ordinary? Milgram suspected something darker. That the seeds of atrocity don't just live in extremists. They live in all of us, under the right circumstances. And so he designed a study that would test obedience in its purest form. Participants thought they were helping test memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher and told to administer electric shocks to a learner, an actor in reality, whenever they got an answer wrong. With each error, the shocks escalated. 50 volts, 100 volts, 200, all the way to 450 volts. The learner screamed, begged, eventually went silent, and yet 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock. Just because someone told them to, they weren't sadists. They weren't criminals. They were regular people, postal workers, teachers, secretaries, and they were deeply uncomfortable. Many sweated, trembled, even laughed nervously, but they obeyed. Why? Because they believed someone else was responsible, because the authority figure wore a lab coat, because just following orders felt safer than asking hard questions. Milgram called this the agentic state, a psychological condition where people see themselves as instruments for carrying out another's wishes. Responsibility is displaced, morality outsourced. Sound familiar? It should, because this same pattern has echoed through history, from soldiers at checkpoints to bureaucrats signing off on deportations, from gang initiations to corporate scandals. People doing harm, not out of malice, but out of routine. It's not always a question of evil intentions. Sometimes it's simply the absence of intention, the passive drift into compliance. And perhaps the most chilling part? The people involved don't see themselves as villains. In their minds, they're just doing their job, just following orders, just keeping the system running. It's in that quiet obedience, not rage, that some of the darkest chapters of human behavior are written. Think about this for a moment. Most harm in the world isn't committed by overt villains twirling mustaches in the shadows. It's carried out by people who blend in, people you pass on the street without a second glance. This was the uncomfortable truth Hannah Arendt uncovered during the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key organizer of the Holocaust. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she saw a paper pusher, a bland, bureaucratic man with no real ideological fire, no foaming hatred, just loyalty to a system. Arendt coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe him. Eichmann didn't personally kill anyone, but he coordinated trains, thousands of them, each carrying Jews to death camps. When questioned, he repeated the same defense. I was following orders, over and over again. Now pause. What does that tell you? It tells you that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly behind desks, disguised as routine. This is where things get truly disturbing. Because if evil is banal, if it's ordinary, administrative, mundane, then it's not something we can easily identify from the outside. There are no flashing neon signs, no ominous background music, just decisions made in comfortable rooms with fluorescent lighting. And if that's true, then we have to ask ourselves, how many of our own daily choices are shaped by invisible pressures? Psychologists call this moral disengagement, the mental process of separating oneself from the consequences of their actions. It's how good people justify bad things. There are many forms of it. Diffusion of responsibility. It's not just me. Everyone's doing it. Dehumanization. They aren't like us. They don't feel pain the way we do. Euphemistic labeling. It's not torture. It's enhanced interrogation. These mental gymnastics allow people to participate in harm without shattering their self-image. And it works disturbingly well. In one experiment, researchers found that participants were more willing to harm someone if the person was referred to by a number instead of a name. Just a number. That's all it took. Names humanize. Numbers sanitize. The machinery of modern life makes this easier. Algorithms make decisions we used to wrestle with. Policies automate punishment. Online anonymity turns empathy into vapor. The system becomes a villain, and everyone inside it claims innocence. But systems are made of people. People like you. And so the real question becomes, where do you draw the line? When does routine become compliance? When does silence become complicity? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary ones, especially in a world where injustice often wears a suit and signs paperwork. Let's rewind to 1971 to one of psychology's most infamous experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment. A group of ordinary young men were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a simulated jail in the basement of Stanford University. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. Why? Because things got dark, fast. The guards, once just average college students, quickly began exhibiting cruel and authoritarian behavior. Some made the prisoners strip naked, sleep on concrete, or endure psychological torment. No one forced them to. No one told them to be evil. They just slipped into it. What caused this? A toxic cocktail of role adoption, de-individuation, and groupthink. You see, when people take on a role, especially one with power, they often abandon personal ethics in favor of what the role demands. Add uniforms, remove names, and suddenly they're acting out a script they never consciously wrote. This isn't fiction. It's human psychology. And here's the most disturbing part. You might do the same under the right conditions. Think you're too moral? Too aware? Too kind? That's exactly what most participants thought too. Social psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who ran the study, later said, "The line between good and evil is permeable, and almost anyone can be induced to cross it." Now, imagine how this plays out in real life, at work, in law enforcement, in politics, in online mobs. Everywhere there are hierarchies and expectations, the potential for harm masquerading as duty is present. You might follow an order, not because you want to hurt, but because you're afraid not to. You might click agree without reading, implement a policy without questioning, or laugh at a cruel joke because silence feels safer than truth. That's the thing about ordinary harm. It doesn't always feel malicious in the moment. It feels normal, but normal doesn't mean harmless. So ask yourself, when have you gone along with something just because it was easier? Whenever you excuse a harmful act by telling yourself, that's just how things are? Because awareness isn't just about seeing monsters. It's about recognizing the shadow in your own routine. Here's where it gets uncomfortably close to home. Most harm isn't committed by raging sadists. It's committed by people who think they're doing the right thing. Or, more hauntingly, people who don't think at all. Take bureaucratic violence. Policies that cause immense human suffering, passed by people sitting in climate-controlled offices, reviewing numbers on spreadsheets. No screaming, no guns, just signatures. This is what political theorist Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil when she covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key organizer of the Holocaust. She expected to meet a monster. Instead, she saw a bland, buttoned-up man who insisted he was just following orders. Not a fanatic, not a sadist, just obedient. That's what terrified her. Evil, she realized, wasn't always fueled by hatred. Sometimes it came from thoughtlessness, from the refusal to question, to empathize, to see beyond one's role. It came from people going through motions. And this banality isn't just historical. It lives on today. In the corporate executive who slashes jobs to boost stock prices. In the tech worker who builds surveillance systems, just doing their job. In the ordinary citizen who scrolls past suffering with shrug, because what can I do? We participate in systems that harm, not because we're evil, but because we compartmentalize. We outsource our responsibility. We say, it's not my fault, I didn't know, someone else will fix it. But here's the catch, harm doesn't need intent to be real. Apathy can be just as dangerous as aggression. And when you add in social pressure, diffusion of responsibility, and the desire to belong, it's easy to see how good people end up enabling terrible outcomes while feeling like they've done nothing wrong. So pause. Think about the systems you're part of. Your workplace, your community, your online spaces. Where might harm be quietly tolerated? Where might silence be complicity? Because recognizing the banality of harm isn't about guilt. It's about awakening. It's about seeing that the line between good person and harmful actor isn't about identity. It's about awareness and choice. So how do you resist this quiet pull into participation? Not by declaring yourself better, not by imagining you'd act differently, but by recognizing that you're not immune. None of us are. In fact, the most dangerous belief may be, I could never do that, because that thought lets your guard down. It feeds the illusion that evil wears a costume, speaks and growls, and shows up with a warning. It rarely does. Instead, it shows up as a form, a meeting, a task, a rule, a justification. So what's the antidote? Moral imagination. The ability to see beyond roles and rules, to imagine the human consequences of your actions, even when they're obscured by bureaucracy or distance. It's asking, who is affected by this choice? What am I overlooking in my comfort? What would I do if this were happening to someone I love? That's not weakness. That's strength. Psychologist Albert Bandura called it moral disengagement, when people mentally disconnect from the harm they contribute to, whether through euphemisms, collateral damage, shifting blame, or minimizing impact. The reverse is moral courage. Seeing clearly, even when it hurts. It's the teacher who speaks up about unfair policies. It's the employee who questions a harmful product. It's the neighbor who checks on someone society would rather ignore. And yes, it's you, choosing to stay awake in a world that rewards numbness. The truth is, the greatest dangers often come not from villains, but from silence, from good people who look away, from comfort that becomes complicity. But the same is true for hope. Every time someone refuses to follow the crowd blindly, every time someone chooses empathy over indifference, something shifts. So ask yourself, not just am I good, but am I paying attention? That question alone can be a kind of rebellion. This part is ends now. We will explore more about behavioral changes and its effects in the next part. Till then, learn how to control your emotions, how to value yourself, how to handle negative behaviors. You are special. You are brilliant. Don't judge yourself as a coward person. Value yourself and comment below what have you learned from this video, and what are your future goals. Stay blessed.